All right, I might start the ball rolling. So thank you all for coming. I'd first, before we do anything, like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Many of us are coming from different lands all over the country, but I am coming from the land of the Gadigal Nation, and I want to pay respects to their elders past and present. Also, just to introduce myself, I'm Daniel Stone, the ED of Principal Co, which is a progressive advocacy and campaigning organisation that works with progressive organisations to try and build their capacity and make them more effective and impactful. When COVID first started, we, along with a number of other organisations, were really shell-shocked about what this might mean for Australia. So we all came together to try and create Australia at Home. Those organisations are The Guardian, the Centre for Australian Progress, Essential Media, the Community Council for Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation. Thinking that with such enormous change, we needed to create a space to think about what that might mean for us in the long term, given that we really felt like the world was really about to change, and indeed it feels like it has. So Australia at Home was a meeting place for civil society to come together to explore those implications and start making deliberate, proactive and positive choices, and begin having discussions about what the future might look like and what we want it to be, rather than getting fixated in the day-to-day anxiety that this kind of conversation came out of. If you haven't been to any of our events before, go to australiaathome.com.au. You can see all of our back catalogue with all of the videos of the speakers we've had there. There's been some really incredible ones with some fantastic speakers. We also have a whole bunch more coming over the coming weeks as well. So go and have a look at them if you haven't already. Before I hand over to Brett Gale from the Chifley Research Centre, who is today's core partner bringing you Dan Pfeiffer, helpfully collaborating with us as part of their Chifley Conversations series that Chifley has been running alongside Australia at Home, I wanted to cover a couple of ground rules. So firstly, we're recording this session to share later. So if that's a concern or an issue for you for any reason, just let us know in the chat. Both Ariane and Hannah are in the chat, as am I, so you can directly message us and let us know if that's an issue. We'll also keep everyone on mute for the majority of the session, just so that we don't have too much background noise sneaking in. But that's not to say that we don't want to hear from you. So please do put any questions, thoughts, queries, comments you might have in the chat that's running alongside this session. And we'll be sharing them with the speakers we've got here, and doing our best to call people up from the audience to pose questions as well. We really want it to be as conversational as possible. Otherwise, what's the point in having a Zoom? You could have just gone onto YouTube. So yeah, please put your comments and questions in there. We want to try and make it as interactive as possible. We probably won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but we will try and get a good spread of them. The other thing that I wanted to just suggest is do try and keep your video on as well. I know that some of us might be eating lunch or pottering around at home, but if you switch your cameras to the grid view, you get to see all of the different people who've joined us. And it's really wonderful, given that we've all been so isolated, to see all the faces and all of the homes of the people that we're spending time with today and feel a little bit more connected. So it's a little thing, but I think it really helps. And after doing a bunch of these sessions, I know it's really made me feel a lot more connected to all of you as well. So on to the meaningful subject of today. I, for one, am really, really excited about this as a big, long-time fan of both Dan's work in multiple different contexts, but particularly as a fan of the podcast Pod Save America, and even back in the day when it had a very different name. And it's definitely going to be one of the biggest Australia Home sessions we've had so far. So thank you very much, Dan, for joining us for it. We also have Brett Gale, who will be our facilitator for the day, who's the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. For those of you who don't know Brett, he has had 30 years experience working across policy and communications roles in a variety of governments and in the corporate sector as well. As a Chief of Staff in the Hawke, Keating, Carr, Rudd Labor governments. I have known Brett for a long time, but even I was impressed to see just how expansive his experience is. He's a wonderful thinker and experienced practitioner, and I think that's what makes his work at the Chifley Research Centre extremely impressive and really valuable to the broader progressive movement in Australia today. So I think we're also very lucky to have Brad, and if you don't know about Chifley, you should definitely head over to their website as well and check them out. To give Dan a more full and substantial introduction, He's no doubt the host of Pod Save America, as I mentioned before, former Obama White House communications director and author of the two wonderful books, which you should also definitely look up if you haven't already. Yes, We Still Can, which is an expression I definitely need to remind myself each day, and UnTrumping America, which is a bit of a guidebook about what to do from here. And hopefully we'll get into some of the meat of that today. So without further ado, I might throw over to Brett now, who will facilitate the conversation over the course of today's chat. And yeah, please give a soft round of applause to Brett.
Thanks, Daniel. I'd too like to acknowledge that I am on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's great, as Daniel said, for Chifley Research Centre and Chifley Conversations to partner with Australia at Home for today's session. What we're trying to do with Chifley at Home, Chifley Conversations, is a series really to look beyond the current crisis to bigger challenges that we face as social democrats, both in Australia and around the world. And we're trying not to chat all COVID all the time. So that's why one of the reasons I'm really excited about having Dan here, because getting ourselves out of our own sort of troubles in Australia and bubbles, it's good to talk to someone overseas, and particularly with the US elections rapidly approaching. And so in Dan's latest book, UnTrumping America, he does three things. First, he argues the case for significant structural change to America's democracy. He sets out the current state of where US politics is at, and he makes a case of how Democrats can win in November. So I'm sure, like me, you're all excited to hear from Dan. So Dan, it's great to have you. I'm going to start by asking the question that we often ask in Australia at Home to our guests, and that is, how are you feeling and coping with these extraordinary situations and times?
I mean, it's sort of hard to believe well, first, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's kind of hard to believe it's happening at times, but my family is healthy. We're safe. We're doing well. We are figuring out how to quarantine and work with a 2-year-old at home. But, given everything that's out there, we feel very fortunate and blessed that we're in the situation we're in. So we're doing pretty good.
And at least you don't have to do the homeschooling.
That's right. Right. And this is probably, we're going to be quarantined with a small child. This is probably a good age because she's independent enough, but we don't, she doesn't have homework and we don't have to explain to her what's happening. Like, she's curious as to why she hasn't seen her friends in a while, but we don't have to explain a pandemic to her.
Yeah, very true.
And anytime she has a question, we can distract her with a snack. So that's still good.
Perfect. I might try that myself. I will get to your book in a minute, but given we are in this current pandemic, I thought, given we are in this strange new world of COVID, what's your view of the impact it will have on the election? Both, I guess, from a mechanical point of view, how the election will run, and I guess on the thing that we're all interested in, the sort of horse race of the election, if you like.
Sure. For some context, America is very bad at elections. We are historically terrible at it for a whole host of reasons, but one of them is, in America, states run elections. So the way an election works in Florida is very different than it works in California, where I live. Depending on how progressive your state government is, depends on how many people get to vote and how easy we make it to vote. And so undoubtedly, even under the best of circumstances, we have this patchwork system where you live dictates how easy it is to vote. That is going to be sort of dramatically worse in this situation, because there is a way to have a fair and safe election in the middle of a pandemic. It can be done. It's a host of primarily centered around mailing people ballots, letting them fill it out and send it back. That is how a handful of states run their elections anyway in the United States. It involves instead of having everyone show up on election day, you would have a period of what we call early voting, where people could go and vote for weeks in advance. So if there are 3 million voters in the state of Wisconsin, you can have, 2/3 of them put in mail ballots, and the last third, instead of having them all show up on election day in small locations waiting in lines near each other, you spread out that over a month period. And so it can be done. The problem is, as of right now, the Republican Party does not view it in their interest to put in all these measures. And so it's the mechanics of it are going to be very, very challenging. A number of states have never done vote by mail before. This was going to be their first election to do it anyway. And usually in the first election where they offer mail balloting, there's a relatively small percentage of people who take it up, and it grows over time. But now, because of the pandemic, they could see huge numbers they're not prepared for. So, in other words, mechanically, it's going to be a mess. And it would be in a close election that has all kinds of consequences for the legitimacy election, battles that come afterwards. It keeps me up at night. Politically,
someone in the chat just asked if there's any chance it'll be delayed.
No, it essentially cannot be. It's in the Constitution. It would require Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader of the House, and Trump to agree on it. So Trump, there is this fear, I get asked this all the time, can Trump move the election? He cannot move it. He can do lots of things to make it more difficult, but he can't move the actual date. Politically, right now, if you look at the polls, Joe Biden has a substantial lead on Trump, and both nationally and in the states, because we have an electoral college where you have to win a certain number of states to become president. Also not an ideal system. But I'd say a couple things about that. One, it is very, very early, right? This is Joe Biden's lead at this point in the race is smaller than Hillary Clinton's lead at the same point in 2016. So this could change. Now, Trump had been planning for, and Democrats have been very worried about him running in a very strong economy where we had historically low unemployment rate. Incumbents usually get reelected they usually get reelected anyway in America, and they've always gotten reelected in a strong economy. It's never happened that they didn't. Trump is a unique figure politically and had a certain set of vulnerabilities that meant he was beatable in that situation. But now our economy, like the rest of the world, is not going to be good. And it's pretty likely Trump will be running at a time when there is double-digit unemployment in the United States. And so if you were to, the way I describe it is anything can change and will change between now and then. Before coronavirus, I would have said that Trump was a slight favorite to beat Biden. If you were to ask me right now, I would say that Biden is a slight favorite to beat Trump, but Biden's very large lead in national polls. When you look at the polls in the states that will decide the election are much closer. Biden is winning in them, but it's much closer. And so it's still a very close race. Biden probably has a slight advantage now, but Trump has 5 times as much money as Biden and hasn't started spending it yet. So we'll have to see what happens when he and his friends unload literally $1 billion of attack ads on Joe Biden's head.
So, I mean, is Biden's sort of approach of, old statesman, been around, calm hand, how's that in the pandemic compared to when you've got Trump out there telling people to literally drink bleach?
I think the changing circumstances have taken what was Biden's probably biggest weakness, was that he had been in, the quote unquote political establishment for a half century. He's been 47 years as either senator or vice president. So I think it is that is a big weakness. America, it generally for if you beat an incumbent, you sort of need to represent change. That's how Obama won in 2008. It's how Trump won in 2016. It was a very hard task for Biden. But in these very uncertain circumstances, and we're sort of seeing every day on our television how an inexperienced, uninterested president, erratic president is handling these things. I think it's taken some of Biden's weaknesses and turned them into potential strengths. So I think it helps him. He's going to, it's not yet a live fire exercise politically. Trump is doing his press conferences. He'll say some mean things about Biden periodically. Biden's out there sort of campaigning because he literally locked in his basement at his house. And eventually there's going to be a lot of advertising back and forth, and how Biden responds to those attacks will determine whether this newfound strength remains such going forward.
So just on Biden in his basement, we've had a question from Stephen Mills in the chat. Stephen, I might ask you to ask Dan that, because it goes directly to Joe Biden's basement.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, Dan. So, I mean, this virus is just so strange in so many respects. And as you just said, the Democratic candidate is locked in his basement in Wilmington. I mean, just physically, how do you do a campaign in these circumstances? How do you connect with voters? Is it going to be an all-ad campaign? Or is there some way that the Democrats can think of to build, other online connections with voters? It's just totally uncharted territories for a contemporary campaign, isn't it?
It is. And we just don't know, right? Like right now, based on what we think our state and local officials are telling us, is that these shelter-in-place orders will begin to lift over the coming weeks. And now that means that Biden could leave his basement, he could do some campaigning, but you certainly couldn't be having these rallies of thousands or tens of thousands of people that are the hallmark of American political campaigns. Another thing American politicians all around the world do is, they'll stop in restaurants and they'll go greet diners, and we joke about it, that politicians shake hands and kiss babies, and now they probably should do neither, right, for the safety of themselves and that. It's going to require a lot of innovation at all levels of the campaign to figure this out, and it's much more incumbent upon Biden and the Democrats to do it than Trump, because Trump has, as president of the United States, and I know this from having worked for President Obama during his reelection campaign, as president of the United States can walk 50 yards from his office into the White House briefing room and address the entire world, right? He doesn't have these logistical concerns. And so we're gonna have to do a couple things. One, to the extent that Biden can be out of his house, what are ways in which you can provide connections with voters, images that are conducted in a way that are consistent with the guidelines being provided? Like, can you do a small gathering with essential healthcare workers, right? And invite the press to that. There's some real logistical issues we're gonna have to figure out. And then digitally, the backbone of Democratic campaigns for generations has been person-to-person voter contact, people knocking on doors, registering voters outside of supermarkets and colleges. And a lot of that's going to be off the table. And so we are going to have to train our volunteers and our staff on how to do one-on-one voter contact through the internet. Now, we very interestingly had a dry run of this in Wisconsin about 2 weeks ago. Wisconsin was supposed to have the Democratic primary election where Biden and Sanders were going to face off. Sanders dropped out before that election, but also on the ballot that day was a state Supreme Court race. And that was very consequential because it helps determine the balance of that court. And this is how bad we are at elections. There's a case before that court that's going to determine how many people can vote in Wisconsin. And so who won that race could determine how that case goes. That whole explanation speaks to a whole host of problems with American democracy that are fairly self-evident. But the Democrats won that election against everyone's prediction, in part because they very quickly transitioned to a new set of organizing techniques. They were teaching voters on how to fill out mail ballots for the first time via one-on-one FaceTime call. Essentially, as opposed they used to teach people to do it at their door. Now they're doing it through FaceTime. The other thing that was interesting was they reverted to a very old technique, which was doing telephone town halls, because it can be hard to get some of the voters we need to reach, particularly in rural areas, to do a Zoom event like this or to do an online town hall because of, maybe they are less technologically savvy, or in rural areas have less strong internet connections. And so they just did telephone town halls, and and this is a state Supreme Court candidate who's getting 6,000 people calling into it. And so I think there are some old techniques we've used before and some new ones, but this is a thing that I've been thinking about a bunch, and a lot of people in the party are thinking about, is what are those strategies to make up for what we're missing and maximize, because there are real opportunities when you have people spending as much time online as they are in this situation, how to reach them.
So do you think that Trump, if there are still shelter in place over the next couple of months, that Trump will respect them, or will he encourage his people to go out and march and rally and do all that sort of stuff?
I think he will. I mean, we've been sort of living through this right now because there have been these protests, very small protests, but it's a very small but loud group who've been going to state capitals in the United States and protesting these orders. And even though those protesters are violating the guidelines that Trump sent out, and his advisors say every day in that briefing the president does, he has backed those protesters. And so I think he's going to do both. He's going to put himself symbolically on the side of the people who are feeling infringed upon by Democratic governors or progressive politicians, while still trying to give himself this plausible deniability. I think, most of the biggest states being run by Republicans are already starting to lift their shelter in place orders, like earlier than Trump's own science advisors would suggest they do. Now we'll have to see what happens, whether that leads to a surge of cases in their states and they have to close down again, or they get lucky. But this is already a battle we're having between what the scientists want us to do and what Trump wants us to do. And that shouldn't, even though the scientists work for Trump, that shouldn't be a problem, but there's a lot of mixed messaging happening here.
Yeah. And Michael Cooney's got a question on the sort of, I guess, electoral math that Biden needs to win.
Yep.
Thanks, Brett. G'day, Dan. I suppose I'm wondering if Biden actually needs to win votes from Trump, or can he win by just winning votes that either didn't vote last time or that are new or are undecided right now? The reason I ask that is because from a distance, it sort of looks and feels like Trump still hasn't really let down or surprised his own supporters. And his number is oddly stable right through the whole period of his presidency. So but maybe that's not a problem for Biden if he doesn't really need to shift them.
Well, he doesn't. So Trump it's about 42% of the vote locked in. They've been with him from the very beginning. They've never left him, not during impeachment, not when he tells people to drink bleach. They're with him. Biden needs none of those voters. Doesn't need a single one of them. He needs a combination of, because the United States, you have to win enough states that add up to 270 electoral votes. It's a little bit of a different math in every state. So if we were just a normal, smart country and we had a rule that whoever got the most votes nationally won, then all he would need to do is just do what Hillary did, because Hillary got 3 million more votes and then even still turn out new voters, right? But because you have to win these states like Wisconsin that are demographically more favorable to Trump, because Trump's base is overwhelmingly white, usually from rural areas. So that population of voters is disproportionately represented in the system and advantages Trump, even though there's almost no scenario where he wins more votes nationally than Biden. So Biden has to focus on three groups. One are voters who did not vote last time, which includes people who have aged into the electorate this time, who've turned 18. There were 4 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 who did not vote in 2016. Now, the geographic distribution of those voters is, many of them are in places that aren't going to decide election, but some of them are in like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So that's group one. The second group there are these voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2008, 2012, but voted for Trump in 2016. Now, a decent number of those voters then turned around and voted for a Democrat in the 2018 midterm elections. So Biden needs to he doesn't need all of those voters, but he needs some of them. And what's interesting thus far is in the last election, they looked at voters, in 2016, they looked at voters who disliked Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So they disapproved of both of them. Trump won those voters by 30 points. Biden is now winning those voters by more than 30 points. Now that could change, so that's it. And then the third group that Biden has to watch out for is there's a group of Republicans who voted against Obama in 2012, but voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 because they're more moderate. They generally live in our suburbs and they do not like Trump. And he's got to hold on to almost all of those voters. So that's the sort of math, and each one of our states is different in what percentage of those three groups you need. But that's the real focus. He doesn't need any of Trump's base. Like the people who have been with him from the beginning will be with him till the end, and they're not an available voter group to Biden, and he shouldn't worry about them. Even if our own political media obsesses with those voters, they're fairly inconsequential in the election.
So Dan, I want to turn to some of the stuff you raise in your book, the more structural issues of US politics. And your first chapter is called Trump is an Abomination, Not an Aberration, which gave me great comfort because I actually wrote a blog post on the eve of the 2016 election saying that Trump was the logical conclusion of the modern Republican Party.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Why do you think that Trumpism will outlive him? And I guess associated with that, is Mitch McConnell the worst human being on the planet?
If the planet melts due to climate change, Mitch McConnell will be one of the people most responsible for that situation by blocking climate change legislation in the United States, therefore making it harder for the rest of the world. So he is one of the worst people in the world. The reason, there is this, to your point, Trump is not an aberration, he's a logical conclusion. And the reason that's important is a lot of American political thinkers, politicians, and even, I have to say, my friend Joe Biden believes that Trump is this aberration, that he is just this force of nature that took over a conservative, not that awesome, but otherwise functioning Republican Party. And then he'll be gone one day. He'll be gone in this election, or he'll be gone in 4 years. And then all the Republicans who've been forced to say they like Trump will go back to being somewhat normal. Now, I worked in the Obama White House for 6 years. I don't remember the Republicans being particularly functioning when I was there. I remember them being quite racist. I remember them embracing the conspiracy theories that Trump embraces. And it's really important in politics to think of incentive systems, how politicians operate based on what are their political incentives. And the political incentives in the Republican Party of the United States and American politics right now is to be like Trump. And before Donald Trump came on the scene, they were also to be like Trump, which is why if Donald Trump had not won the election, the Republican nomination, it was not going to be Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or these other politicians who I think are also bad, but were more normal Republican politicians. It was either going to be Donald Trump or Ted Cruz. Those are the two options. And the only difference between them is Ted Cruz is a little bit smarter and much less likable. So that'll tell you something. And so it is just the Republicans they had, after Obama won, when Obama won in 2008, it sort of shifted politics in America because Obama mobilized this group of young voters who had not voted before. And he took advantage of the changing demographics in our country as we were becoming a country that was less white. And Republicans had a choice after that, which was, one, they could have a more broadly appealing agenda that could do better with young people, do better with African American voters, do better with Asian American voters, Hispanic voters. There was a path to that. The other option is to double down on their white base. And that's the path they chose. And they can get away with that because they passed a bunch of laws that make it harder for voters of color and young people to vote. And the system sort of accidentally, right now, demographically favors them, where their voters are overly represented within our electoral college and our Senate because the more diverse, younger Democratic coalition has tended to move into the same states. And so they've been moving to California, they've been moving to New York, which is giving additional power. It's diluting the power of our coalition. Even though we have a majority of voters in the United States, we have nowhere near a majority in the United States Senate and do not currently have the White House.
There's a great line that struck me in your book where you said, Democrats need to end their obsession with the presidency, even though you don't have the White House. Can you give us some insight into what you mean by that?
Yes. Our party tends to wait around for generational talents who will save us, right? And that comes that's what Bill Clinton was in 1992. That's what Obama was in 2008. And we haven't yet proven that we can win an election with someone who is not a generational political talent. And as we wait around for these generational political talents to come, what we are not doing is the hard work of building political power at the state level. And an example of that is, as I mentioned at the top, U.S. elections rules are decided at the state level. So when Obama ran in 2008, the very important states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania all had Democratic governors. By the time he ran in 2012, because Democrats, ourselves included in Obama world, did not pay enough attention to those elections, those states all had Republican governors. And they changed the voting rules to make it harder for us to register new voters, to turn out our voters. And they've been doubling down on that strategy. And if we had been, over a long arc of time, investing time, energy, and resources at the state and local level, we would not be in that situation. We would have more fair elections all across the country. And the presidency is very, very important. I had the great privilege of working in a presidency. There are amazing things you can do, but a presidency is time limited, right? It is less powerful than you think it is, and real sustainable political power is built at the grassroots level, and we did not. And the Democratic Party has not focused on that enough. That has changed in a lot of ways since Trump won, but we still have more work to do.
I think Kirsten Andrews in the chat had a question about some of the capacity of Democrats in terms of comms and social media campaigning.
Yep.
Thank you. Yes, my question was about comms tactics. You've talked a lot in the pod about the importance of an advertising spend, particularly on social media channels to the election outcome. I'm interested in your view about the balance of priorities for both your advertising spend versus efforts that you might spend on a campaign to ensuring that you get earned and shared media coverage. What's your view on the way a campaign should approach their time and resources in those areas?
I think traditionally campaigns have thought of those as two silos, right? So we have earned communications over here, and that's where we're going to try to get press, and that's where the communications director and the press secretary work. And over here is the advertising. And they rarely meet. Periodically, there'll be an ad that the press team will share with the media, or the press team is answering questions about how much money is being spent. But I think what we have to, that wall has come down in a world of social media. So my view is that what we have to do is have a holistic strategy that is centered around content. And some of that content is organic, like the candidate's Instagram post or Twitter post. Some of that content is press coverage, and some of it is paid advertising. And what we have to think about is, the reason why it needs to be holistic is, because the internet has broken up big media as we think about it. Most media, at least in the United States, is speaking only to an already decided partisan audience. And so what you have to think about is, we know we need X number of voters and Y number of places in the country. In our job, like the job of I call the person the chief content officer, it could be the chief persuasion officer, it could be captain message, whatever you want to call it, right? But like, their job is to persuade voters. And so sometimes that will mean we want to share. We know from our research that the voters that we care about in this part of the country are really interested in healthcare. And so we'll show them some ads that are about our healthcare plan, but also if there is a story on CNN that is about why our healthcare plan is better than our opponents, we're not going to just hope that they happen to be walking past the TV when that story airs. We're going to pay to put that story in their social media feed. Like, we will promote it into their Facebook feed, or we will show it to them as a pre-roll before they watch streaming television. And the other thing that is a part of this, and this is where the other silo of the campaign, which is field organizing, has to merge with them, which is now we also want all of our supporters who are online in any way, shape, or form to be sharing our content with their networks. And so you have like every person is walking around, I don't know what the numbers are in Australia, but in the United States, every person is walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket, and they have, on average, a network of at least a couple hundred people between Facebook, Instagram, and the contacts in their phone. So how can the campaign be organized such that says, we want our volunteers, our supporters, to share our ads with their networks, because now we're getting free advertising from it, because instead of us paying Facebook to show it to people, we're also asking our supporters to show it. How can we ask them, remind people to vote? Can we, in a real technological sense, map their contacts to figure out which contacts they have live in the state of Wisconsin, the United States? And can we tell our supporters who know people in Wisconsin to remind those supporters to register to vote when that deadline comes up? And so, like, the idea here is, how do we create the right content and put it in front of people? And campaigns spend a ton of time on content creation, right? What the ad looks like, what we're going to put on Facebook, what the tweet is, what the story is, and not enough time on content distribution. How do we get it in front of people? And we have the tools now, because of you can target in digital advertising in a pretty efficient way. And so I think it's no longer the balance. It's all about persuasion. Some of that persuasion is going to be paid. Some of it is going to be organic. But every news story that's written about your candidate, every interview they do, is theoretically a piece of, it's like, yes, people will see it as it airs, but it's also a piece of content you now can share organically or through a paid way to persuade people, if you believe that content has the possibility to persuade the voters you care about.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think Sally Situ had a question along these lines as well about comms and the use of comms, and in particular crooked media and what you've done with Pod Save America.
Hi, Dan, and thanks, Brett, for hosting this. I'm a long-time listener of the pod, so super excited to be on. But I'm keen to find out what you and the team think the podcast can contribute to the communications in progressive circles. It seems to me that you're using the podcast to turn supporters into activists and also fundraise and help equip supporters with talking points and information. What do you think the balance is between all those different things that you're trying to do, and what else are you trying to contribute from the company?
Sure. I mean, the genesis of crooked media is the idea that in the United States, we have a very robust conservative media. Thank you, Australia, for the Murdochs. And very limited progressive media. And in a social media world, quantity of content matters. And so right now you have all of these conservative outlets pushing all of this conservative information into Facebook and other social media, so shifting the conversation. You're much more likely to stumble on a piece of conservative content on Facebook than progressive content. And we're like that. So crooked media is one small piece of what I think is a very larger effort. From the crooked media perspective, in addition to just building up progressive media, and Pod Save America in particular, we like to think of, like, we sort of describe ourselves, sometimes publicly, but mostly internally, as Pod Save America is a place that not only tells you what's happening in the news, it tells you what you can do about it. And we have been incredibly lucky and that we have been able to build a substantial audience. And a lot of our audience are people who were never involved in politics before 2016. So they're new to all of this. They don't, they're now interested. Many of them were just tuned out. They didn't think that, maybe they thought politics didn't matter. Obama was president, Hillary would definitely win. You didn't have to engage. And now they know they have to engage. They just don't know how. And so we want to teach that, we want to give them information that they need to make decisions about how they can get involved, right? So that's volunteering, that's donating if they have the financial wherewithal. It is helping teaching them. Like, we've done video tutorials, we've done it in television shows about how to knock on doors, why you shouldn't be scared to go canvassing or phone banking. We think of our audience as this force multiplier where we teach them, or we tell them what we think the message should be. They can carry that message in their own social networks as they're talking to their friends that don't vote, or their uncle who may be slightly leaning towards Trump, right? We're trying to give them some information and arguments that can help. And I think the last part of it is, you know, we have people in America running from everything from dog catcher to school board to local mayor. None of them can have the funding to hire, do a poll or have political consultants or any of that stuff. And so we also like to think of ourselves as giving hopefully good, but definitely free advice for people who are engaged in politics, even people running for office. And a lot of times as we travel, we'll run into the, people who've just been elected to the state assembly, the state legislature, or the mayor in these small towns, and they'll say, I used your podcast as my consultants. And so it's like, that's the other element. We're trying to do all of that in a way that is hopefully approachable and entertaining to people, so that people will keep coming back.
Do you think, someone just asked this in the chat, do you think you'll expand internationally, grow the crooked media empire to include, Australia and the UK and other places?
There has been some, we did a tour, I did not go on it, but I had a young child, well, still a young child, but she was quite young at the time, did some Europe touring, and were we not staring down the barrel of the most important election in American history, we would, I think we would have thought about doing so, traveling. Australia is a place where we know we have a lot of really wonderful listeners and would love to get to. And I was last there with President Obama in 2014, I think, and would very much love to go back with my freedom this time. I think, obviously Tommy Vitor, who on Pod Save America, who does Pod Save the World with our friend Ben Rhodes, like there's a lot of interest in the world, and we'll sort of have to decide what the state of affairs is in America as to whether, there's, what the international plans are, but we're obviously very interested in what's happening around the world and are very appreciative of the people who've engaged with us from far outside the United States.
Cool. So a number of people have asked this question, but I might give it to the chair of Chifley Research Centre for obvious reasons, and I'm sure people understand. So Linda White.
Thanks. I'm glad it's obvious. Dan, it's hard to discern from here who the likely running mate for Biden is likely to be. Can you give us a kind of your best guess as who that might be and why?
Well, so I have no actual information, so let's stipulate that. And I don't think Biden does either yet. He's at the very, very beginning of what is a pretty rigorous and arduous process. Many of you, I'm sure, know this, but for those who don't, Biden has pledged in this campaign that his running mate will be a woman. So he will select a woman as vice president. There is sort of a short list that is going around in American politics that I think is probably close to right, that includes some of the people who ran against Biden, like Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar. It also includes Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor but ran for governor of Georgia, one of our states, and lost, and a couple of other folks. And I think Biden is going to have to think about, knowing him as I do, he will certainly not pick anyone who he does not think can step in right away. And that is, I think that would be true if he was 58 instead of 78. And that would be true if we were not living in the middle of a pandemic. But I think the political relevance of the readiness of the person has gone way up. Because that decision is usually the politics of the vice presidential pick is dramatically overstated. We tend to think it's, going to move this state in this direction, or it's going to get this huge group of voters to turn out. And it's usually something that happens on the margins. And it's more likely that it's something that won't win you an election, but it can lose you election, as John McCain discovered in 2008 when he picked the very qualified Sarah Palin. But I think this time voters are going to pay a lot more of attention. I don't know, like, I honestly do not know what the guess is. I suspect that it is highly likely that he would have ethnic diversity on the ticket as well, and that would mean someone like Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, or there's a senator named Catherine Cortez Masto from the state of Nevada, who I think would all be very excellent, quite qualified individuals.
The entirely unscientific straw poll happening in the chat seems to be heavily favouring Stacey Abrams at the moment.
There's a lot of I am a gigantic fan of hers, and I think she would be amazing, and she is brilliant, and I think would be a real asset on the ticket in a lot of ways. The question will be for her is, she's not a senator, she was not a governor. Like, the bar, she's going to have to sort of cross a higher resume bar than the other candidates who are senators. I have no doubt that she could step in and be president in 2 seconds if she had to be, because she's that smart and that good. But for the public, that's the case, that she's going to have to make the Biden into the public.
I want to touch a little bit on the second half of your book now, which is about the long-term changes that you think need to be put in place to improve American democracy. And I guess is where the untrumping in the title comes from. That is, once you've got rid of Trump, how do you reverse the sort of things that he's done, but also make US democratic institutions better for democracy with a small d. So if you could get your fantasy Dan Pfeiffer super PAC up and running, what are the 3 things you'd advocate for change?
Well, the first thing would be I'll start with a thing, like, I talk about a bunch of different things in the book. Some are actually very easy logistically, but challenging politically. Others are maybe less challenging politically, but very difficult logistically, right? And so I'll start with the logistically easy things. So first and foremost, one of the huge problems we have is in the United States Senate, which is one of our 2 legislative bodies, every state, regardless of size, gets the same number of senators. So California, which has 47 million people, has the same amount of political power in the Senate as my home state of Delaware, which has less than 1 million people. And the demographics of people moving to bigger cities and bigger states are making that problem much worse. And so right now, it is actually possible in the United States. And so to be in control of the Senate, which means and when you have control of the Senate, you decide every bill that comes to the floor. So this is why Mitch McConnell is terrible. Mitch McConnell in control of the Senate can ensure that Joe Biden never passes a single bill. He can ensure that Joe Biden never appoints a single judge. He has that much power. And control of the Senate right now could happen with states that add up to 18% of the United States population. So 18% of the United States population could have 51% of the power in the Senate and decide who sits on the Supreme Court. So how do you fix that? The first thing you do is you can add states to the union. Our capital city of Washington, D.C. is not a state. Everyone who lives there pays taxes. They all vote in the presidential election. They have no senators and no vote in Congress. That is insane. It's also much bigger than Wyoming, which has 2 senators. Puerto Rico, which is a Commonwealth. Everyone who lives in Puerto Rico is an American citizen. Everyone who's born in Puerto Rico is an American citizen. They also have but they cannot vote in the presidential election. They have no voice in Congress. And this is how crazy the system is that if someone who lives in Puerto Rico moves to Florida or anywhere else in the country, they can vote once they've lived there for 3 weeks, basically. But if you stay in Puerto Rico, you can't vote. So that makes no sense. So the U.S. State Senate should immediately make D.C. a state. That would help Democrats because D.C. voted 90-10 for Hillary over Trump. And if the people of Puerto Rico wanted to become a state, and that is a question they would resolve on their own, but if they wanted to, we should have a state as well. So I would help make more states. I would try to make the Senate more democratic. The second thing is we need to change the composition of our Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell the aforementioned horrible person, essentially stole a Supreme Court seat from Obama. He used his power as a Senate leader to make the Supreme Court essentially be deadlocked 4-4 and unable to rule for an entire year to save a Supreme Court seat just in case Trump won. Trump won. And so now the Republicans have a 6-3 conservative majority on the court. And the problem we have is the oldest justices, therefore the two most likely to retire, are people appointed by Bill Clinton. The Brett Kavanaugh, who was just put, this is how, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg is our oldest justice. Brett Kavanaugh was just put on the court. He was an absolutely horrendous individual. When Brett Kavanaugh is the age, and our just point of background, which I'm sure most people know, our justices have lifetime appointments. So they can serve until they die, until they quit. So when Brett Kavanaugh is the age that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is today, her daughter will be 32. She turns 2 this month. So you're looking, absent an aggressive change of the composition of the Supreme Court, we are looking at a world where you will have a conservative Supreme Court for decades, regardless of how many presidential elections and Senate elections and congressional elections Democrats win. And this is all happening, and I would point to the backdrop of where the American voting public is getting more progressive and more democratic. The country is getting more, it's getting younger, it's getting more diverse. There are more voters who profile as Democrat. Joe Biden, even if he loses the presidential election, will almost certainly, presuming we can conduct an actual election, will win by more votes than Hillary, will have a larger popular vote margin than Hillary Clinton did. As far as the eye can see, no Republican president will get a majority of the votes in America. They could still win the presidency because of our electoral college. And so the last thing I would do, which is more logistically challenging, is get rid of the electoral college. It requires the change of Supreme Court, all it takes is a vote of Congress and a signature of president, so it's pretty easy logistically, challenging politically. Getting rid of the electoral college and having us move to a straight popular vote system would give people a lot more. A lot of Americans are basically out of, like, their vote doesn't count for president because of where they live. Like, if you're a Democrat who lives in a Southern Republican state, it doesn't matter if you vote or not. And because you didn't vote in the presidential election, you're now not voting for your member of Congress. You're not voting for your city council member. And the same thing is true in Democratic states. Like in California, huge numbers of Democrats could decide not to vote and would make zero difference as to whether Joe Biden will win this state. And so if you got rid of the electoral college, it would make our democracy more representative of the actual majority of Americans, and it would give people more incentive to participate, which is something we desperately need to do, which is why I do argue in the book for adopting your system of voting, which people think is insane here in this country, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. We think it makes a lot of sense here too. And people, you know, we have a mandatory voting, as you know, and all sorts of things that I think have really strengthened Australia's democratic.
Yeah, I think right.
Yeah. So we're nearly running out of time. So there are a couple of questions. One, someone asked, who would win the fictional election between Frank Underwood and Donald Trump?
Definitely Frank Underwood. Smarter.
Exactly. And Tim Watts, who's one of our MPs here, has a question for you on the Philadelphia race.
A question, Dan, on an area of your expertise. I'm interested in the Pennsylvania race. Is Aussie Brett Brown the man to lead Ben Simmons and the 76ers to a title, firstly? And second part of the question is, the Rights to Ricky Sanchez pod has already promised to come on a Down Under tour. So when is Pod Save America going to do so?
I would love to have Pod Save America be on the undercard of the Rights to Ricky Sanchez podcast tour. So I don't know that my non-Philadelphia 76er fan co-hosts would be that interested in that, but I would definitely come along and open for Spike and Mike without a doubt. And I'm a big fan of Brett Brown. I'm a big fan of Ben Simmons. I have adored Brett Brown as the coach of the Sixers for whatever it is, 6 years now. Been a rough year for, not for Ben Simmons, he's actually had a great year for Brett Brown. But I have missed the NBA, and I hope Brett comes back if and when the NBA starts playing again.
One last question, Dan, and I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it while I'm thanking everybody. Given the times that we're in, what's your positive takeaway from the time that we're in and you know, where the whole world seems to be falling apart and, you know, it's a very tense election over there. So be interested to know, because we like to end on a happy and positive note. But from me, while Dan's thinking about that, I just wanted to thank Dan for being part of this. I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. We had up to 480 participants at one point, which I think is the highest we've had on the Australia at Home thing. I'd really recommend, if you go to the Chifley website, look for our upcoming events on chifley.org.au, because we've got a number of Chifley conversations coming. And I wanted to thank Daniel Stone for introducing us today, and also all those behind Australia at Home, including The Guardian and Essential Media and Principal & Co. So I'll give the last word to Dan about
before
what is positive.
Jump in, Brett.
Yeah.
I might also just do like a little bit of other admin. Thank you very much for your acknowledgement as well. We will also be sending out a bit of a feedback sheet to everybody after this is over. So please do fill that out. It's not just a bureaucratic exercise. Like, we actually really like getting the feedback and have acted upon it over the last couple of weeks. And also, I really encourage everyone to check out the rest of this week's Australia at Home Lunch series as well. So we've got Claire O'Neill tomorrow, which is going to be a really interesting conversation. And then on Friday, we're going to be talking pictures with Andrew Mears and John Tass Parker. And then that evening, we're having a really exciting May Day dinner, which is our first dinner event, where Billy Bragg and a whole bunch of really powerful union leaders from across the country will be coming together to acknowledge that day, given we can't all do that in person at the moment. But yeah, so yeah, remember to do the feedback sheet and check out the rest of this week's events. But back to you, Brett and Dan.
Thanks, Daniel. So Dan, last word to you. Positive takeout for the world that we're in at the moment.
I would say we are digging deep in a dark cloud for silver lining, but I think I'll steal a story from my former boss. So right after the 2016 election, I was back in Washington, and I stopped in to see my former coworkers and the president. And, you know, it's very like, the White House is pretty empty. A lot of the lower level staff have already been sent home. It's a few days before, it's probably a week or so, I guess, before Trump's going to take over. And no one's particularly busy, in part because the incoming Trump administration is refusing to meet with the Obama administration to learn how to do their jobs, which we're seeing the consequences of now. And I saw, and I wrote about this in my first book, but I saw Obama, went in and saw him, and we sort of like were catching up, and he was asking me about, I had recently gotten married at that point. He was asking me about my wedding, et cetera. And at the end, I sort of asked him how he was doing, like how he was feeling with everything. Because he certainly had never expected that he would be succeeded by Donald Trump, and that a lot of his, you know, very hard work and legacy would be in very real danger. And he's an eternal optimist, and he said something to the effect of, you know, maybe this will show people that there truly are, that the two sides are very different, and that politics matters. And I think we, in America at least, have been, because Trump had managed to be a personal embarrassment, a national and international embarrassment, and a sort of a political disaster, but he'd been sort of surfing along on all of Obama's hard work. Our economy was going fine. He'd been actually very lucky in terms of the crises that he'd faced. And now, in the midst of this, at a time in which we're seeing the very real consequences of not just an incompetent president, but a conservative political philosophy that hates government, and that it's never a good idea to put people who hate government in charge of government when you need it, I think can be potentially very influential, not just in this upcoming election, but in what the right way to think about politics and governance is. And so I think that like this lays bare the difference between progressive view of the world and a conservative view of the world, and we're seeing what works and what doesn't. And I think so that is silver lining one. The second silver lining I would say, and I'm seeing this in our country and across the world, is even when our political leaders fail us, the people are rising above that. And in this country where, you know, we have Trump telling people to drink bleach, and we have these Republican governors who are making these insane decisions, you have these heroes in our hospitals and delivering food and working to keep our supply chains running, and they're doing it whether they love the president or they hate the president, whether Republican or Democrat, and that there is still, like, despite all of the polarization and division and acrimony, that there still is an underlying sense of national unity when it matters. And I think that that is something that we can aspire to if we can give the American people around the world better leadership, that there's an opportunity to give people leadership that is commiserate with what they deserve.
Fantastic. That's a great uplifting note to end on. I couldn't agree more. We should always put our trust in the people in the end to do the right thing. And, you know, one of the things we've been working on at Chifley is this idea that this is a time to now reinvigorate in people the knowledge that government actually can do good for people and is there as a force for good. And hopefully that's one good thing that will come out of this bad time we're facing. But many thanks, Dan. Thanks for joining us from early evening over there in San Francisco. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.